Good afternoon, everyone. I am so grateful for you being here for a very, very special event today as we take time to honor the life and to remember the extraordinary impact of the late Honorable Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the occasion of what in Jewish tradition is called Shloshim, the end of that first month of mourning period. Today is an extraordinary opportunity to learn with some wonderful, wonderful scholars and students of the court and students of American jurisprudence. I'll have a chance to introduce Dahlia Lithwick and Ambassador Rabbi David Saperstein, who will be leading our panel discussion today. But I just want to take a quick moment to think about what it is we've come here to commemorate today. So yesterday, my 17-year-old daughter celebrated her birthday, and I was thinking a lot about the world that she is growing up to inherit as she is on the cusp of her adulthood. And I'm thinking about how so much of the opportunity, so much of the world in which she is growing into was created by the efforts and by the tenacity and the impact of an extraordinary Jewish woman who's just a little bit older than her. And to think about how her life and my daughter's life coming in her wake are so inextricably linked, because one woman dared to attempt to make a difference, and there not only changed our country, but really changed the world and opened the doors to opportunity for millions and millions of people, including my daughter. And so today, as we reflect on Justice Ginsburg and we reflect on her life and her impact on the law, we're so grateful to be offering this wonderful program in concert with Temple Bethel's Nuremberg Project. This is a project that uses the instruments of our synagogue and our partnership with Lynn University to create a sense of connection between the love of law that we find in Jewish tradition and also the law that we see in the performance of real human life and in the way that we salvage the human project through the rule of law. And so it is my very, very special privilege to thank the stewards and the brains behind that project, Marilyn and Jay Weinberg, for not only underwriting today's event, but also for their constant support of Temple Bethel and our Nuremberg Project. Thank you so much for your friendship and your support, and we'll have a chance to see you a little bit later in our program. Today, we are blessed to have three really, really incredible people who will be leading our discussion today. And the first is Dahlia Lithwick. Dahlia Lithwick is a senior editor at Slate and has been writing her Supreme Court dispatches and jurisprudence columns for more than 20 years. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Harper's, New Yorker, Washington Post, New Republican Commentary, and is the host of Amicus, the Slate's award-winning biweekly podcast on law and Supreme Court, which was being recorded yet again today. In 2018, she received the American Constitution Society's Progressive Champion Award and the Hillman Prize for Opinion and Analysis. In 2013, she won the National Magazine Award for her columns on the Affordable Care Act, has twice been awarded an Online Journalism Award for her legal commentary, and was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in October of 2018. Ambassador Rabbi David Saperstein is about as close to a rock star as a Reform rabbi can possibly make himself. For many, many years, he was the director from the Reform Movement's Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C., and was probably the most influential Jew on Capitol Hill who was not elected to public office, and I would dare say maybe even more effective than some who were themselves elected. He was named by Newsweek magazine as America's most influential rabbi and has done so much work in advancing the causes of progressive Judaism in America, especially focused on church-state law, which he teaches at Georgetown University. Recently, he has been the international leader of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, and for 2 years, in 2015 to 2017, Rabbi Saperstein served as the United States Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, appointed by President Obama, and as a principal advisor to Secretary of State John Kerry. There are so many more things I could tell you about Rabbi Saperstein, but I'm just grateful to count him among one of my great mentors and friends. And lastly, we have with us Robin Bresky, who many of you know as a member of our community. Robin is the founder and president of the law offices of Robin Bresky, a boutique law firm that focuses on appellate law and trusts and estates. She is past president of the National Conference of Women's Bar Associations, a fellow of the American Bar Association since 2001, a member of the Appellate Judges Conference. Statewide, she represents the 15th Judicial Circuit, I should say, on the Florida Board of Governors, and is a former president of South Palm Beach County Bar Association and the Florida Association of Women Lawyers, who in 2019 named her Woman Lawyer of the Year. She has been a longtime volunteer here at Temple Bethel at the Legal Aid Society of Palm Beach County, and won the Women of Distinction Award for Community Service from Legal Aid and from other organizations. We're so grateful for Robin for helping to lead our discussion today, and so I send it over to you.
And before we go to that, we're actually going to put up a slide with CLE information. We are blessed every year to gather together for what is called the Project Nuremberg Lawyers Lunch, and it is open to lawyers and non-lawyers, and we have lawyers and non-lawyers with us today as well. But for those of you who are attorneys, there are CLEs that are awarded for today. You can take a picture on your phone of this screen, and we will also put it up at the end. The reference number is 2007645N. The title is Justice and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, A Reflection. The level is basic, and it is 1 general CLE credit. And as I said, we will put this slide up again at the end. Thank you so much. And now we will hand things over to Dahlia.
Well, I want to thank you at Temple Bethel. I want to thank the Nuremberg Project. I want to thank Jay and Marilyn for making this possible. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Justice Ginsburg's two kind of prongs. One is her career as an advocate and then as a judge. And then I want to talk a little bit about her as a Jew, and then we'll turn it over to Rabbi Saperstein, who will pull on some of those threads. But I can't tell you how much I needed a shloshim for Justice Ginsburg. I was very, very lucky. I got to interview her in January, right before the court closed down for COVID. So I actually got one of the last in-person interviews with her, and it's been really quite a bracing and complicated thing to try to celebrate her memory in lockdown. So I'm delighted to be with you. I think what I want to essentially do is lay out her career in 3 acts, if I can. The first act as a litigator, the second as a kind of get-along centrist judge, both on the DC Circuit at the Supreme Court, and then the third, where we all got to know her as iconic, notorious RBG, because it's hard, I think, to knit together those 3 stories, but I think they're essential to understanding the full person and jurist that was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The first act, if you've seen the movies or read the books, you know she graduated at the top of her class at Harvard Law School. She entered Harvard, one of 9 women in a class of more than 500 men, famously called upon by Dean Erwin Griswold, then the dean of the law school, to explain why it was that she felt she was entitled to take a spot that should have gone to a man, suffered all the predictable things that you would suffer in a law school where you are an only or one of a few, graduates at the top of her class, cannot get a clerkship. Everyone else of her stature would have easily been given a Supreme Court clerkship. Couldn't get a job for a very long time. Ended up at the ACLU Women's Rights Project, where she becomes, as you just heard from Rabbi Dan, this absolute juggernaut, bringing case after case after case in the 1970s that challenged the notion that women and men should be treated differently under the law. And I just want to pause to say that the secret sauce in those cases was that she brought them on behalf of men. She would be standing in front of all male panels of judges, most of whom genuinely believed that when law treated women differently, treated them as though they were delicate hothouse flowers who shouldn't be expected to be able to get credit cards or serve on juries or do anything because women are special. she had to bring the cases on behalf of men in order to say, look, this is what's really happening. And so case after case, she would find a male plaintiff who was somehow victimized by an unequal status in the law. And she would say, look, this is just a dad who's trying to take care of his son, or this is just a man who's trying to take care of his ailing mother, or this is just a man who's not allowed to have the benefits because his working spouse was in the military. And because she managed to convince panels of judges that that was unfair, that men were being faced with discrimination, time and time again, she won. And she won all but one of the cases she argued before the US Supreme Court. Although it's worth noting that one of the justices watching one of her performances graded in his notes, C+, very precise female. But that was RBG, a very precise female. And it leads me to this phase 2 of her story, which is that she is elevated to the DC Circuit, the federal appellate court for Washington, DC, the most powerful court under the US Supreme Court. And she largely aligns herself, believe it or not, her voting record shows herself to be aligned more often than not with Antonin Scalia and Robert Bork. She's a centrist, get-along judge, always trying to forge consensus, never burning bridges, by no means a radical. And in fact, when Bill Clinton ends up tapping her for the US Supreme Court, the biggest opposition she faces is not from the political right, it's from the left. It's from women's groups who think that she's too old, too boring, too small bore incrementalist conservative, and she almost doesn't get the nomination because until her husband Marty, who was the love of her life and is a whole different speech, until he intervened and told women's rights group, she's okay, she's going to be on your side, she's much more radical and subversive than you believe. She was tarred as an old school, boring, anodyne feminist, and that really is the character that in some sense she brings to the Supreme Court. Initially, she is a get-along jurist. She is very careful never to burn bridges, never to upset anyone. It is emphatically true. The rumor is true that her closest friend for the years on the DC Circuit and the US Supreme Court was Antonin Scalia. And while they were radically different in temperament and even in jurisprudence, that friendship meant the world to her. To her, the idea that you could reach across ideology, politics, gender, race, all of it in order to have a deep and abiding friendship with someone with whom you disagreed fundamentally. That was an incredible, incredible marker of how she thought about the world. So I think my Act 3 really begins after Sandra Day O'Connor leaves the US Supreme Court, and suddenly RBG is the only woman at the court. And suddenly she starts to morph. Her writing changes. She stops citing other people. She starts to write these blistering dissents that once they're set to music, really, I think, catapult her into this other world of rock star, icon, 87-year-old phenomenon that every single 7 and 8-year-old girl dresses up like for Halloween. And that's the part of her story that's a little bit harder to parse, because she does go from being very moderate and careful and scrupulous to being really angry, and not angry in any way that would burn a bridge, but she really starts to talk in her own voice, to speak out even on the bench, to write very, very differently. And that becomes, I think, the linchpin of the identity that she fosters for the last 10 years. But it kind of is a surprise, I think, to people who only know that part of the story, only know her as an angry feminist dissenter, that for most of her life, her character was not that of anger, rage, outrage, or bridge burning, that for her entire life, including that last period, the thing that she prized most was the advice that her mother gave her, which is be a lady. But I think that the essential thing that I would say, and that I've really learned thinking about her career in the last few years and getting to spend time with her over the last few years is that at some level, I think she gave up on the current court and she started to talk to law students and she started to talk to high schoolers and she started to talk to those 7-year-old girls who wear the dissent collars on Halloween. And just totally anecdotally, when I visited her at the Supreme Court in January and got to spend an hour sitting with her and talking about her life, at no point was she really focused in on me. I was asking the questions and the tapes were rolling and we were doing an interview, but she was laser focused on our 20-year-old intern who we had brought along because she did all the research for the project. And Justice Ginsburg never for 1 second took her eyes off Molly, because she knew, I think, and I love how Jewish this is, that when she was dissenting, she was writing for the future. She wasn't writing to change anyone's mind. She didn't think she was going to pick off votes much anymore at the court, but she was writing, I think, as a flare that she was sending up to young women around the country, that no one was coming to save them and that they were going to have to fight. And I think that that was also just a quintessential RBG characteristic, although I think Rabbi Saperstein will tell you, it's also a deeply Jewish tradition to write from a place of dissent, hoping that at some point in the future, the world will see who you really are. I think the last thing I want to talk about, because I think it's important, and I also think it's important in that it aligns not just with this conversation about her shloshim, but also it aligns, I think, with the Nuremberg Project. And that is just the extent to which Jewishness was such an essential part of Justice Ginsburg's character. And when you read even the essays she was writing in high school, she was thinking about injustice and how it pertains to being an outsider in the United States. She always talked about what it was like to drive around with her parents and see signs up in rural places in the United States that said, "No dogs, no Jews." And she always thought of herself as somebody who could use the machinery of the law to help privilege outsiders who had been locked out of the American dream. And she really, I think, saw herself, and her project is kind of the antithesis of the notion that the framers were perfect and every word of the Constitution was flawless. I think she saw herself as part of a deeply Jewish project of making sure that the door was open to everybody, that the people who came after who had nothing. She really did live in a world in which she saw people fleeing the Holocaust, coming and settling in Brooklyn. She understood that the law could be used both to light up and make the world just, and also to horribly oppress minorities. And I think she saw her work fundamentally as part of this deeply Jewish arc of using the law to lift up everyone, and especially to lift up, as the prophets would say, the widows and the orphans and the poor, and to make sure that justice was accessible to everyone. And I think that one of the stories I heard, I'll close with this, one of the stories I heard a few weeks ago from one of her classmates at Harvard, who kept in touch with her entire life, was that when Justice Ginsburg came to celebrate her getting an award, the thing she quoted at her was "Tzedek, tzedek tirdof," justice, justice, you shall pursue. That she felt her entire life was about pursuing a thing that was elusive, was always a little bit out of reach, but that if we worked together was achievable. And that if she didn't get there, that next generation would get there. And I think, especially now in this partisan, rancorous time, for me, what I center when I think about RBG, what I want to give you on this virtual shloshim, is the idea that justice is a project. It is a job. It is not something ephemeral in the sky. It is something we all together, from generation to generation to generation, have to work on. And we do that with dignity and decorousness. We do it incrementally. We do it the way she would have done it, but we have to keep picking up the job of justice that she tasked us with and paying it forward. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dahlia, so much. We're so grateful to have you today and look forward to more. But now we're going to turn to Rabbi Saperstein, who will share his own reflections as well.
Okay, so it is a pleasure and an honor for me to be back here, back again, virtually at least, with your wonderful Bethel Synagogue, with my friend Rabbi Dan, my colleague Rabbi Jessica, and the truly remarkable Dahlia Lithwick. She is a treasure for all of us who care about these issues, a brilliant journalist and legal analyst and a thoughtful Jew, as I think you all sensed. I must share also how moved I was with the impressive folks you've had participating in the Nuremberg program that the Weinbergs have been helping make possible, formidable speakers over the years, including most fittingly last year with the memorable Ben Ferencz. He really gives all of us something to strive for when we get to be 100 years old. It was really stunning how widespread and how deep the grief was over RBG's passing. Here, I'm going to focus on two issues, build on how Dahlia ended on her Jewishness, and talk a bit about the area of my academic focus in my teaching for 35 years at Georgetown University Law School, her rulings in the church state area and religious freedom. First on the Jewishness, when I reviewed some of the questions that the lawyers who are part of the Nuremberg community here had sent in, let me just focus by dispelling two extreme rumors. One that was circulating after her death for a while is, despite what you may have read, she did not think about becoming a rabbi. It was long before any of the seminaries would have accepted her, and it just wasn't where the passion of her heart was. The rumor appears to have started with a headline in a Jewish telegraphic agency story that began with a headline was "From Camp Rabbi to Pursuing Justice." She was knowledgeable enough Jewishly to lead as a teenager camp services, but that was the extent of her rabbinic career inclination. And the other extreme was that because she wasn't allowed to be counted in the minyan for St. Kaddish after her mother's death, that she abandoned all ritual Judaism. Some actually questioned the propriety of holding her up as a Jewish role model, considering her restricted Jewish ritual practices. Justice Ginsburg was a proud Jew to whom Jewish culture was absolutely vital. She was raised with a strong Jewish background and able to make intelligent decisions as to which traditions and rituals were important to her and which were not. While not traditionally observant, Passover Seders were a big part of their family, the recognition of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and other Jewish holidays were part of the discourse. She appeared regularly at synagogues to speak and was able to participate easily in the services that she was a part of. She had had a good Jewish upbringing herself and provided that for her kids at Temple Emmanuel in New York. I discussed this and communicated with her son Jim over this. Speaking of synagogues, by the way, our distinguished colleague, Rabbi David Stern at Temple Emmanuel in Dallas, tells a lovely story about RBG. In 2016, what was called their preschool beehive class, the 3 and 4 year olds, decided to name their new class fish Ruth Beta, B-E-T-A, Ginsburg, in honor of Justice Ginsburg. They sent her a letter of tribute and a picture of the fish. And she wrote back a handwritten note on her Supreme Court stationery saying, "Dear Beehive class, I just loved your letter, and I'm so glad you named your fish after me. Cheers, RBG." She had a great sense of justice and a great sense of play. Here, she was, as I'm sure you all know, deeply committed to keeping the meaning of the Holocaust alive. Consider two statements from her memorable 2004 Holocaust Museum speech. She said, In striving to drain dry the waters of prejudice and oppression, we must rely on the measure of our own creation, upon the wisdom of our laws and the decency of our institutions, upon our reasoning minds and our feeling hearts, as a constant spark to carry on, upon our vivid memories of the evils we wish to banish from our world. In our long struggle for a more just world, our memories are among our most powerful resources. She said in the same speech, I am a judge, born, raised, and proud of being a Jew. The demand for justice runs through the entirety of the Jewish tradition. I hope in my years on the bench of the Supreme Court of the United States, I will have the strength and the courage to remain constant in the service of that demand. And of course, she had a mezuzah on a door and the words, Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdov, justice, justice shall you pursue, on the walls of her chamber. Here, I had the interesting experience of, well, let me actually quote those words she said that Dahlia alluded to when she received that honor. She wrote, on the walls of my chamber of the Supreme Court, I have posted the command from Deuteronomy, Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdov. For those words are an ever-present reminder of what judges must do that they may thrive. Here, so I had the interesting experience of taking Merav Michaeli, a labor member of the Knesset, into herself a groundbreaking figure in women's rights in Israel, into Justice's chambers to meet RBG. A fascinating conversation, but Justice Ginsburg turned her attention to those words on the wall and reflected on them. I want to go back to when she was brought into, inaugurated into the Hall of Fame, and fittingly to the Nuremberg thing. Towards the end, she said, when I had the good fortune to become active in the movement to open doors for women, enabling them to enter occupations once close to them, I was heartened by the words of a girl of my generation. That girl wrote, one of the many questions that have often bothered me is why women have been and still are thought to be so inferior to men. It's easy to say it's unfair, but that's not enough for me. I'd really like to know the reasons for this great injustice. Until recently, women silently went along with this, which was stupid. Since the longer it's kept up, the more deeply entrenched it becomes. Fortunately, education, work, and progress have opened women's eyes in many countries. They've been granted equal rights. Many people, mainly women, but also men, now realize it was wrong to tolerate this state of affairs for so long. Yours, Anne Frank. This prescient comment was one of the last entered into her diary before she was imprisoned in Bergen-Belsen. So this was a deep theme in her life and a powerful one. Let me switch for a moment to what she had to say about church-state issues and religious freedom. And her views accord so strongly with those of the Reform movement. She had a strong commitment to religious freedom. I saw it in her dissent in the Goldman case. This was a case in which an Orthodox Jew wanted to wear a kippah, who was in the military. For a long time, he had been allowed to wear the kippah, but after he had testified against the army as a witness in a court-martial case, they began to clamp down on his ability to wear his kippah. And the court decided there was no right in the army to wear that. And she wrote a very good dissent. I actually had the opportunity to work with Frank Lautenberg, the senator from New Jersey, to write legislation to actually restore that right that we thought should have been constitutionally protected. And I used her dissent as a guideline to how to write that legislation, which passed unanimously in the United States Congress, and the Army acceded to that. She, in another case, which also tangentially had to do with work that we did at the Religious Action Center, Cutter v. Wilkinson, she wrote the decision, I believe unanimous, that upheld the provisions in the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Person Act that allowed an accommodation religion here to protect the rights of prisoners in jails. This was a bill that was written after the Supreme Court struck down the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And at first, we actually tried to follow the decision of the court in striking down the RFRA bill law. We tried to follow what the court had said to write another bill called the Religious Liberty Protection Act. And I had the opportunity to be at a dinner with Justice Scalia and about 20 other people. And I asked, did he think we could actually do such a thing, write a law that would pass constitutional muster? I don't know any other justice that actually would have responded to that, other than Justice Scalia, who didn't hesitate for a second and said, no, actually not. Here, this is just an end run around our right to determine the Constitution. Well, at some point, I walked out of that coalition with the majority of people, and we wrote the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Person Act. And we came up with a bill that was approved unanimously by the court. And again, her decision was an enormous affirmation of the work that the reform movement had done in this issue. In the last term in the American Legion, American Humanist Association case of the big Latin cross that stood in the middle of a traffic island at the center of a busy intersection, which the government had argued was historic and represented all World War I veterans. She, who had been married to a Jewish veteran, said no. When it is a government property and the government erects that, it is a government endorsing what the message of the cross is, and that is a religious message as well as the historic message involved, and it couldn't stand. And finally, I would point out on the most vexing issue of religious freedom today, that is how you balance out religious freedom claims to civil rights claims. She wrote a very strong dissent in a Hobby Lobby case in which she warned, the court, I fear, has ventured into a minefield by its immoderate reading of RFRA here. And she returned to that in her final dissent last July in the Little Sisters of the Poor case, arguing that one does not allow the religious beliefs of some to overwhelm the rights and interests of others who do not share those beliefs, believing that the civil rights protections of women and the civil rights protections of minority of all kind here who are protected in classes under the law were a sufficiently compelling interest for the government to restrict religious freedom. All of those accord with the positions of the reform movement. In the end, we will see whether or not the dissents that she wrote, like the dissents of Louis de Brandeis and Oliver Wendell Holmes, that were these ringing dissents that later became the law, will become the law, as has been the case already with some of her dissents. She's left an important legacy in that regard. She wrote those dissents for tomorrow, as Dahlia said, and we are all the better for them.
David, thank you so much. As a product of the reform movement, to know you first as an icon and a leader, and then with your dear friendship with Rabbi Levin and Temple Beth El, as truly someone who is a beloved part of the synagogue. We got emails, people grew up with your father, with you, knowing you, and just amazing. And Dahlia, it's so appropriate in the week that the portion talks of the Tower of Babel and the confounding of language, that you do the opposite. You are so articulate and express the inexpressible. And it is an honor to have both of you. We are going to hand things over right now to Robin Bresky, whose bio you heard at the beginning. She is a true partner with myself and the Weinbergs in the Project Nuremberg Lawyers Luncheon, and an incredible leader in the synagogue and the legal world and the community at large. And we're going to bring the three of you up, Dahlia and David, onto camera for some question and answer with Robin Bresky. Robin.
Great. Thank you so much. It is just, what a wonderful program. And thank you, Dahlia and Rabbi, for being here. It was really enjoyable to hear from each of you. I have some questions that members, mostly attorneys from our temple have posed, and some things that we'd like to know. The first question I have is actually for both of you, and maybe Dahlia, you can answer first, and then we can turn it over to the rabbi. You mentioned, Dahlia, about Justice Ginsburg's great friendship with Justice Scalia, and that is certainly well known. They had very different legal philosophies, as you pointed out. How did Justice Ginsburg come to her philosophy as seeing the Constitution as a living document? And how do you contrast her philosophy with Justice Scalia's originalism and strict constructionist interpretation? And further, how could those two things be reconciled with that friendship? And lastly, what can we learn about that?
That was like a law school 7-part hypothetical. And I just want to say, I always adore, I always learn something when I'm in conversation with Rabbi Saperstein. It's really an honor and privilege to be with you and to be with everyone here. I asked each of them on a purely personal note how they could be friends with someone whose some of their writing was anathema. Justice Scalia once wrote that something that Justice O'Connor had written, and Justice Ginsburg and O'Connor were very tight, was not to be believed, that it was so astonishingly badly reasoned. He was very strident in his mocking, and he could be very cruel. And yet Justice Ginsburg maintained that friendship. So I've asked each of them why they were such good friends and what lashed them so tightly to each other. Justice Ginsburg's answer was always, he's funny. He's just really funny. And that was her Marty's superpower too. She really had a wicked sense of humor. I don't think anyone would say Justice Ginsburg was laugh out loud hilarious herself, but she was very, very, again, so Jewish, right? So fond of somebody who could make her laugh. Justice Scalia, when I asked him how it was that this friendship endured decades of often really rancorous, at least in terms of written opinions, disagreement, and he said, she's just the smartest person I know. And that every time I send her a draft opinion, it comes back better. And that everybody should have a friend that they profoundly disagree with who makes their work better. And I think there's real lessons for all of us in both those answers. I think it's fairly easy to say that Justice Scalia was comfortable being an originalist or a strict constructionalist or an original public meaningist or whatever word you want to use. It's 31 flavors. But I think he would have said he was comfortable with that because he genuinely believed that the framers got it mostly right. And when they didn't get it right, the Constitution was amended to get it better. And that if you don't think it works, you should amend the Constitution again. I think Justice Ginsburg's orientation was exactly opposite. I think she would have said that a Constitution that was drafted by patriarchal, white land-owning, often slave-holding men, by definition, had gaps, and that her work lay in the interstices of the vision of the framers that was good and right, and what they left out or couldn't anticipate or couldn't know. And it's interesting because if you ask Justice Ginsburg, should people rely on the United States Constitution as perfect text, she would say, no, it's really old. Look at what they've done in South Africa. That's much better. They have protected and enshrined the right to human dignity. We just got it wrong. So I just think she didn't have any magical thinking about the actual words of the text. I think she felt that a lot of constituencies were quite deliberately left out of the original text. And so I don't think it's hard to sort of understand why those two orientations were as opposite as they were. I think what you can learn from them is, And it's ironic in some ways because Justice Ginsburg was almost Talmudic in her how driven she was by text and meaning. She was not, making it up as she went along, freewheeling. She was incredibly careful and precise. And so I think that what I learned from the tension between their two constitutional visions is that you need a little bit of both. And just as you need, the original text and the original meaning, you also need, I think, a more capacious view of who is left out of that project and your role in promoting it. I think that toggling back and forth between the words as framed by the writers of either a statute or the Constitution and what has been left out and who has been left out and why. I think that's the kind of justice that we could all, I think, learn something from. And so there's something in finding, the middle space between those extremes that I think is a very Ginsburgian project.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. My experiences with them exactly the same. We were having dinner one night with Justice Ginsburg and a mutual friend, my wife and I. And I can't imagine her ever telling a joke, but her quips were so funny sometimes. Her one-liners, these little observance of things. Scalia is a really interesting figure in this case. First of all, it's an interesting conversation whether or not he was really consistent about his originalism when it ended up with a result that he didn't like. I think there are times he really did depart from it here. But he was like a Jekyll and Hyde in writing decisions. He would write every decision as though this was his last. And he wanted to get everything off his chest about how he felt about his colleagues' views on those things. In person, he was the most charming, gracious, funny. I mean, he and Marty, I hadn't ever thought about it that way until you said it, Dahlia. They really were very similar here. And I'm not surprised at all. And interestingly, Elena Kagan has also developed a relationship with Scalia. And she's probably further from views than some of RBG's views were here. And they too have become very close personal friends. Go hunting together. Who would have thought? Here, for those who never heard her tell the story, Kagan, in order to get a vote from a Republican senator who said, "I'll give you the vote if you promise to go hunting after you get appointed." She said yes, and went hunting with Scalia and couldn't bear, closed her eyes as she took her first shot and aimed away from a bird, and the gun backfired. Pushed back on her, and she actually ended up killing the bird. Was the thing. Here they became very close friends, and I think that's we need more of that in America today. The breakdown of bipartisanship on the Hill is one of the great losses to America at this moment when we face so many crucial decisions.
Thank you both. Rabbi, you both mentioned her husband, Marty. Could you tell us how her marriage to Marty influenced her life? He was obviously a brilliant legal mind in his own right. Would she discuss cases with him? And did his influence ever find its way to her decisions? And finally, how did she deal with his loss?
Dahlia may have come up with more interesting insights in this, but let me tell you what I do know. First, Marty Ginsburg grew up just about a mile and a half from me. Here, we both went to Cornell University. We both spent much of the academic part of our lives teaching at Georgetown University Law School. Here, we would always joke about being landsmen here from the same area together. Here, we didn't talk much about his academic work. One of the leading tax lawyers in the area of mergers and acquisitions, not exactly my specialty here. Here, but he would always be interested in what I was doing and things like that. He clearly was a major supporter of her in every way, shape, and form. You've read the stories about the two of them. She gave up part of the options she had when they first had children, and he gave up options to be supportive of her. He clearly pushed very hard for her to get the appointment. The people around Clinton have acknowledged, had it not been for Marty's pushing, she would not have been appointed to the court. No one could begrudge him. He was such an avuncular, wonderful, thoughtful, funny person. You just couldn't ever be angry at him here. To what extent his thinking on the law, actually what they talked about, I have absolutely no idea. Here, I know from my own career, being supportive of my wife's career, what things we can talk about and what things you just can't. She's a journalist, I'm a lawyer and a rabbi. I have areas of confidentiality. She has areas of confidentiality. We know there are limits, and like a Venn diagram, you hope that the area that overlaps you can talk about is significant, and we enrich each other. But Dahlia, you may actually know more from the interviews than I do about that.
The two stories I love to tell about, first of all, if you saw any of the movies, and there's Marty like manfully chopping scallions and raising the children and having the complicated emotional life with, surly teenagers, and there she is kind of a robot. You realize, like, I came home from watching the movie and said to my husband, who, by the way, is the greatest feminist and is raising our teenage sons, why can't you be like Marty? I mean, I think he was just a singular feminist, even all these generations later. I think that one of her cautionary tales that she always told young women is, you have to negotiate these things. If you are not in a genuine partnership, it doesn't just happen. And I don't think she understood that even then and even now, that partnership was absolutely, I think, balanced and fair, as Rabbi David just said. I mean, the two quick stories that I would tell are that first case, the very first case that she brought at the 10th Circuit, when she was representing somebody who was a man who was being subject to discriminatory views of gender roles because he wanted to stay home and take care of his mother. That was a tax case. Marty found that case for her. And he's the one who came running to her and said, I think I found a hook by which you can start to unsettle all the statutory provisions that treat women differently. So that was Marty. And she gave a wonderful speech at the 10th Circuit a few weeks after he died, it was his speech, he was meant to give it, called How I Got My Wife Her Very First Good Job. And that was his speech, and he really did get it for her. The only other story I love to tell, because she loved to tell it, was that at the very end of his career, Chief Justice Rehnquist, who again, polar opposite jurisprudentially, doctrinally from RBG, at the very end of his career, they did not agree on much, wrote this beautiful, beautiful opinion in the Family Medical Leave Act case with deep compassion for what it was to be a person who's working and juggling and trying to care for someone who's sick and has children. It's absolutely unlike anything Chief Justice Rehnquist had ever written. And it turns out he had written it because his daughter at the time was divorced and had kids, and she would dump the kids in his chambers. And he suddenly realized, this is what women's lives are like. I mean, I had no idea. And so he writes this gorgeous, open-hearted opinion about the need to have statutory protections for people, largely women, who are trying to be caregivers and work. And Justice Ginsburg always tells the story of how when Marty read the draft opinion, he yelled down the hallway, always yelling down the hallway, Ruthie, did you write this for him? Like, he thought she ghost wrote it for him because it was such a big-hearted, capacious view of what women's lives were like. And I just want to say she told the story not just because it's a funny story, but I think it goes to something Rabbi Saperstein said, which is she always believed she could persuade. And she always believed that the feminism that she was pushing was contagious and that men could catch it. And she really did think she kind of brought along, and I think she did bring along, not just Rehnquist, but Justice Kennedy, to her way of seeing how it is to be a woman. And that was an emblematic story for her of, at the very end of his career, the Chief Justice embracing a much bigger view of what a woman's life was like, in no small part because she was there working the refs.
That's fabulous. Thank you for sharing that. Adalia, what do you think it was like for Justice Ginsburg to serve on the court as as only the second woman. And what was her relationship with Sandra Day O'Connor like? And what was her relationship with the women that came after her, Justices Kagan and Sotomayor? Did she see it as her role to mentor them?
Another four-part question. You're killing me. So I think that she really felt that she benefited massively from the fact that Sandra Day O'Connor did the spade work. Sandra Day O'Connor was the one that made sure there was a women's bathroom, she did the literal hard work of being the first. And Justice Ginsburg always said being the only is terrible, because every time you open your mouth, people think you speak for all women. And being the second and even being the third is powerful, because nobody looks at you anymore as though you are emblematic of the whole gender. And I think she felt very, very grateful to Sandra Day O'Connor, who, by the way, supported her through cancer and who supported her time and time again. They were, O'Connor was appointed by Reagan, Ginsburg was appointed by Clinton. They agreed in the aggregate over their years together on the bench about 50% of the time, which is to be expected from a liberal and a conservative. On gender cases, the data shows they agreed more than 90% of the time. So they were, in some sense, real sisters-in-law, in that when it came down to gender, they really saw the world the same. And very famously, every single year that the two of them sat together on the bench, some oral advocate, including once the US Solicitor General, would call Justice Ginsburg Justice O'Connor, and would call Justice O'Connor Justice Ginsburg, so much so that the National Women's Law Center had t-shirts made for them that said, "I'm Sandy, she's Ruth, I'm Ruth, she's Sandy," because every single time, every single term, someone confused them. I think when Justice O'Connor died, it was a really profound inflection point for Justice Ginsburg when she became the only. When I said earlier, her voice really changed, it began to change then. I actually carbon date it to a strip search case where a teenage girl was strip searched by her school, and all the men on the bench were laughing about how funny and ha ha ha, and did they search her from the inside out? And Justice Ginsburg was livid. She was like, "This, you have no idea what it's like to be a 14-year-old girl strip searched without your consent or the consent of your parents by your school." And that was when this voice that Rabbi Saperstein is talking about, the dissent in Hobby Lobby, the dissent in Lily Ledbetter, comes from when she's the only, and she feels like it's her job now to represent all of womankind, which, by the way, she never wanted to do. And I think the last point is she was very close to Justices Sotomayor and Kagan. She really did feel a responsibility, I think, for lifting them up, making them comfortable. And just on a very last point, which again goes to something Rabbi Saperstein just said, she gave the dissenting opinion in Town of Greece, which was a really important religion case. She deliberately gave that, right? She was the senior justice in the minority, so she was the one who could assign opinions. She gave it to Elena Kagan to write about in a very early case in Justice Kagan's career that had to do with Christian prayer, that was supposed to be non-sectarian before every single legislative meeting. And this is what she said in 2014 when she explained why she wanted to give that dissent to Elena Kagan. She said she was also an outsider, even in her own religion, and that she had to fight to be the first girl bat mitzvahed in her Orthodox synagogue. I think she has that sensitivity. It's something my colleagues don't understand. They've never been in that situation. And so I think she felt a real kinship. And it goes back to, I think, some of her disaffection with how she wasn't allowed to say Kaddish for her own mother. But I think she really felt a deep kinship with Elena Kagan as somebody also who had experienced America, both with all the privileges of being an insider and also the profound lingering sense that she was an outsider.
So to follow up on that, you mentioned with regards to mentorship, how do you think she, her mentors impacted her willingness to mentor others? You mentioned her talking to the 20-year-old and the younger generation. Can you talk about that a little bit? Yes, Dahlia.
She was so careful always to talk about the people who came before her. At her confirmation hearing, she started by saying, I stand on the shoulder of giants. She talked about Harriet Tubman. She talked about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. She was at every turn, in every public setting I ever saw her, she talked about the males who opened doors for her, whether it was as an undergraduate in high school, at law school, the men who went out on a limb, Jerry Gunther, who went out on a limb to get her a clerkship. And so I think she really felt that she had been the absolute lucky beneficiary of male mentorship throughout her entire life. And that doesn't even include what Marty gave her. And so I think that sensibility of pay it forward, make sure that I do for the next generation what was done for me was an absolute cardinal principle for her. She really always said, almost to the point of, I would say, unseemly modesty, that she would not have been where she were but for the men who pushed her forward. And she was at pains with her clerks, with young women journalists like me, always at pains to say, you have to do this, step forward into the light and then bring forward the people who come behind you. It's, again, a very, very Jewish idea of being a link in a chain.
Thank you. And Rabbi, a question for you. You spoke a little bit about this, but how do you think her Judaism and her Jewish upbringing created a lens through which she saw the law? Did she bifurcate her Judaism from her jurisprudence at all?
I think both of us have spoken on this as much as we can. I think, in light of some of the conversation with Judge Barrett in terms of the role that religion plays in her life that's up now, I think what is the kind of general rule is one doesn't use religious law as a substitute for the constitutional issues that one has to decide on as a judge. It may infuse your general ethos and aesthetics here, but decisions have to be made on what the US law is as a judge. And Judge Barrett, who is a very deeply observing Catholic here with very religiously conservative views, has made it clear when asked the question, no, here, my religion does not substitute for the law. I decide on the basis of the law. And I think the same is true with Justice Ginsburg, that her Jewish ethos, aesthetic, infused a life, who she was, set broad dynamics of how she thought about the world. She fully acknowledged that. I think it's true with every legislator that their religious values and views will offer an ethical frame for how they think about issues. But the law has to be done on the law, accessible for reason, discourse. It can't be ever based only as a matter of faith, because faith cannot be challenged, et cetera. And this is a very important part of the dissent issues. When she talked about building for the future, that's kind of a very Jewish idea about the idea of dissent. In the Mishnah, 2,000 years ago, in Idiot 1:5, the rabbis who had established, as in the story of the oven of Achnai, for those who are familiar with it, that no longer was heaven going to intervene in deciding what the law was. Even a heavenly voice saying what the law should be no longer would apply. From now, by the majority of the judges, will the law be. And that allowed halakha to develop and flourish. Otherwise, it would have withered and died. By the majority of the judges, would the law be here. And yet, the Talmud always records minority opinions. Elu ve'elu, we're told, these and these are the words of the living God. And the rabbis here ask the question, why? And they're very explicit. What is a minority opinion today may be found by a future court to be worthy of becoming the majority opinion. So that idea of dissent is embodied into what she said about dissent that Dahlia alluded to before, that the dissent is not just to differentiate myself from my colleagues. It is to set a parameter for what the law should become tomorrow. And I think that in her case, when there's a more balanced court, that many of the dissents she has written actually will become the law of the United States.
And Rabbi, following up on that, could you pick one of her dissents? What do you think was her most, did she think was her most important dissent? Do you know?
Well, Dahlia would, again, be, I really would like to hear what she has to say about that. I'll take the low-hanging fruit. On the majority opinions, probably I think she would say the VMI decision, that kind of desegregated gender-wise VMI, which she said a couple of decades later when she visited the school, I knew it would make the school better, and I believe it has. Of course, that very school is dealing with racism issues right now. But I think she was very proud of getting that decision, which I believe was a 7-1 decision when it was written. And fitting to, just to go back to Dahlia's story about Elena Kagan, the exact same thing happened in this decision. That decision was actually given to Sandra Day O'Connor to write as the senior person in holding the view on it. And she said, no, this has to be Ruth's decision. And she gave Ruth that decision to write. So that link of the women on the court, actually different links in its own chain of tradition here on these issues. And I presume the answer would be, she would talk about this, was the Lilly Ledbetter case about disparity of same pay for same jobs between genders. The court did not say is protected by the Constitution. And she actually said explicitly in her dissent, here, I hope that the Congress will move quickly to implement legislation that will solve this problem. It did, like I did in the Goldman case here with the law that was written, it really followed her dissent. She laid out a blueprint for how to do it. I think that she's most proud. But those are kind of the famous ones. Dahlia, you may have an idea about some others.
The only other I would add is Shelby County in the Voting Rights Act case, where she, and again, I don't think anyone thought she was a phenomenal wordsmith. She was very careful, but she wasn't always sort of a flashy writer. That was Scalia's jurisdiction. But she wrote that extraordinary sentence when the court, by a 5-4 margin, struck down the heart of the Voting Rights Act that protected minority jurisdictions that had been Jim Crow vote suppressive jurisdictions. That was struck down. John Roberts writing, oh, racism in America is over. We don't have a problem with systemic or structural racism in voting. And she wrote this incredible prescient line. She said, the Voting Rights Act is working. And getting rid of the Voting Rights Act because it's working is like putting away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And now we're looking at massive, massive vote suppression in Texas, in Alabama, in Florida, all of those jurisdictions that were covered in the Voting Rights Act that would have been subject to judicial scrutiny or to supervision by the courts, all of them now passing vote suppressive laws because the Voting Rights Act is gone. And it really does feel like, oh boy, did we ever put away our umbrella thinking that we weren't getting wet. It is, in my view, particularly here we are less than 2 weeks before an election where we're seeing North Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama suppressing votes of particularly minority voters, that she really lit the way to the world that we find ourselves in now.
Amen to that.
Well, thank you both for sharing your views and sharing about RBG's legacy and her life, and really greatly appreciate it. I'll turn it back over to Rabbi Dan. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much again to Marilyn and Jay Weinberg, our sponsors. Many thanks also to our wonderful, wonderful moderator today, Robin Bresky, and many thanks to Rabbi Saperstein, Dahlia Lithwick. We learned so much from you today, and I think we really took the opportunity to honor the late Justice. I just wanted to conclude with a prayer to mark her memorial, the El Male prayer. So if you can, as we conclude, put yourself in a prayerful place and think about her life, not simply as a jurist and a great American, but also as a mother and a grandmother and a trusted friend to many people. El male rachamim shochen bamrumim hamitzei menucha nechona tachat kanfei hashchina b'malotim kedoshim etohorim kezar harakia mazirim et nishmat yakirenu ashofetet Yita Rachel bat Natan v'tzir Leah shelcha leolama al harachamim Yastireha beseter kenafecha leolamim v'tor chaim enishmota Adonai unachalata v'tanuach b'shalom al mishkava v'nomar amen. O God, full of compassion, you who dwell in the heights and in the depths, grant perfect rest under the wings of your sheltering presence, along with all those souls holy and pure whose light shines forth from the heavens. To our beloved great Justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who has entered eternity. O God of mercy, let her find refuge in the shadow of your wings, and let her soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. Dear God, you are her inheritance. May she rest in peace. And we say, Amen. Thank you all for joining us for this wonderful panel today. We hope everybody has a wonderful Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.